Hey guys, it's Pam from the Stitch TV show here with a tutorial about making a fun holiday wall hanging. So I found myself faced with a couple different supply opportunities, and by that I mean I had a lot of several types of things and I just wanted to use them up because that's kind of how my brain works. I'm like, I have a lot of this thing, I need to use this thing to make something else. So the two things that I found myself faced with were a lot of random green strips. So I do a lot of pieced bindings and scrappy bindings, and so I tend to collect strips in my preferred width, which is 2 1/8. And I had a number of these in greens, and you can tell some of them are Christmassy. This one has poinsettias, some of them are not, like this is just green. And so knowing that I had all these strips, I wanted to make kind of an improv pieced funky Christmas tree. Now the other thing that I needed to use up was a lot of gold buttons. So through the course of my sewing career, I've inherited two button collections. I've inherited from my grandmother and my aunt. And in addition to the own pieces of clothing that I've bought that come with extra buttons, I ended up with this random collection of gold buttons. And so once I get my improv tree kind of pieced together and quilted, then I'm going to stitch some buttons on. So this is going to be a bit of a longer tutorial, kind of a project from start to finish. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about how to actually prep the background for this. And you can see I've got red markings on here. So I started with a square piece of fabric. I started with 18 inches. You can make a smaller one and do whatever size works for you. And this is going to be a foundation, so it doesn't matter what this fabric looks like, other than it will be helpful for it to have a lighter background. So as you draw the marking, you can see it on both sides. So I've actually drawn this red line to indicate this triangle, and I drew it from a bottom corner to the middle of the top, and make two lines, and then the bottom of the tree will be this part down here. Now I'm going to trim it to size later, so no problems there. But to get the foundation piece, I didn't want to lop this part off because I'm going to use some measurements from these side pieces to help me cut what I want to be my finished sides. So start with the square fabric. Mine's 18 inches. I marked on the back side, and this isn't going to show because it's foundation, so use whatever marker's going to mark on one side and show through to the other, and this is going to help you with placement. So we're going to start with a strip, and I want it to be kind of funky, so I'm going to put it at a bit of a wacky angle. I'm going to grab my scissors and I'm going to snip off this excess piece, and you don't have to be exact. We're going to trim this up later. So I'm going to have this piece be kind of funky, and I throw my extras off to the side. So now I need a longer piece. So this obviously too short. So I'm going to come in after I'm done knocking the camera, and this piece looks like it's long enough. So I'm going to kind of ooch it to one side so I will have an extra long piece later to use, and I'm going to flip it like so, and then I'm going to stitch along here. So let me go do that, and then I'll be back with how we progress and start doing more pieces. Okay, we have this seam sewn. So what we're going to do now is flip, and you can tell I've got some threads, no big deal. I'm going to run my fingernail along this seam to kind of crease it. And let me just clip these out of the way because they're going to drive me batty. Now if you're using commercially prepared jelly roll strips with pinked edge, you are probably not going to have those little threads poking through. That's one of the benefits of the pinked edge, despite its many frustrations. So, okay, we now have this piece. So what we could do is continue building in the same angle. And because all my strips are the same width, remember they're from my strip stash for doing binding, it would have very much a level of sameness, just kind of going up the tree. But I want to make it kind of funky. So I want these to kind of angle in like this, where this strip is shorter on one side and wider over here. So when you do that, and you kind of flip it over, and just make sure that you've got coverage. Like under this seam, I need to make sure I've got coverage. Now I am going to put one pin in just so it doesn't shift as I'm moving over under my needle. I'm going to do it at the end that I'm not starting from. So when I'm doing a sew and flip method like this, I like to keep the shortest part of the fabric towards the throat of the machine. That way it reduces bulk. Now this piece is only 18 inches, so it's not that big a deal, but it does turn out that I'm actually stitching kind of on the reverse side because I'm coming down this way. So my 1/4 inch seam is on the opposite side of the needle that I'm used to. Now that doesn't really matter because you don't actually have to do an exact 1/4 inch. In fact, I have a regular stitching foot on my machine. And so I know the distance between the needle center and the edge of my foot is 3/8. And so I can use the edge of my foot here. And 3/8 isn't going to matter. That's not that much additional bulk because remember I'm going to be quilting this and then adding buttons to it. Okay. All right, now I'm just using scissors to kind of whack off the excess from the strips because I don't need to be scientific at this point. So when I fold this back and kind of run your fingertip or fingernail along that, you see I'm starting to get this kind of funky angle. So I can come and trim this if I wanted to. Honestly, I'm going to leave it because I'm using darker fabric and it's not going to shadow or show through this top layer. So if you were using a lighter fabric, particularly if you're alternating light and dark fabrics in this kind of method, you're going to want to trim that excess. But for my purposes, I don't need to. So I'm going to continue stitching and flipping and adding more to these things. And then we're going to come back, and once I have the whole thing covered, we're going to talk about how we measure these outside triangle pieces to complete the top, and then what we're going to do on the bottom down here as well, because the trees, they don't sit directly on the ground. They have a little bit of a trunk. So I'm going to keep stitching and flipping, and we'll be back shortly. Yeah, so I'm going to play with these fun reindeer, and sometimes you want to lean into that angle even more, and sometimes you want to mix it up. So it's just going to vary based on your own preference and the size strips that you've got available too. I will say one note, when I get all the way to the top, it may be easier for me, rather than use a strip of fabric, is to just pull a square out of my scrap stash, like a 3.5 inch square, just to make this top point on it, only to reduce bulk so I don't have like some weird 1/2 inch strip up there. So I'm going to do that. I'll be back in just a minute with this entire thing kind of covered with my fabric strips. Okay, we are back, and I have all of my strips sewn on. Now you can tell they are going all over the edge. I do have coverage because you can see my stitch lines extend beyond that marked edge that I have here on the back. So let's talk about how we cut these side pieces. So essentially what you're going to do is get a rectangle of fabric that is 1 inch taller than the piece you started with. So remember, I started with 18 inches, and this is to scale. ish, but clearly not the fabric because it won't all fit on the screen. So you start with something that's an inch taller than your height. So mine was 18. So I'm going to get something that's 19 inches tall. And then you want half of the width. So half of the width, half times 18 is 9. And you want to add an inch to that, 10 inches. So I start with a rectangle that is 10 inches wide and 19 inches tall. Now, if it's a solid fabric, I'm done. And we'll talk about why that is. If it's a print fabric, I actually need 2 of those. So let's pretend this is my piece of fabric, my rectangle. And what you're going to do is draw a line corner to corner. Now, an index card has a right side and a left side. Let's call this the right side because it's got lines on it, and this the wrong side. So normally you would use a rotary cutter. I'm using scissors. So you cut that triangle, and you're like, cool, I have my 2 triangles. Oh, wait, I have 2 left triangles, because that's the way that rectangles work. They're kind of a pain in the butt that way. Now, if this were a solid fabric, you could just flip that one over and it wouldn't matter, because the right side and the left side of a solid fabric and many batiks is the same. But because I have a print fabric, what I had to do is take my 2 pieces of fabric, right sides together, boop, so line side to line side, and cut both on the diagonal. And I didn't mark this one. So now, when you do this, you have 2 right sides. So, revisit the math. You want your height plus an inch and half your width plus an inch. If you got a print fabric where it's going to matter that there's a wrong side and a right side, you need 2 of those. Put them right sides together. So I, through the magic of taping, have both of my pieces. So let's talk about how we're actually going to stitch these. So this is the back side of my fabric, and this piece goes on this side. And let me move the camera up so you can see the whole piece now. So what's not helpful is just taking this and kind of like hoping it works by flipping it over, because you do need to stitch right sides together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop a pin about 1/4 of an inch up from my marked line on the back, and I'm going to eyeball it, and I've brought it up to 1/4 inch in on my background fabric, and I'm just going to pin that in place. Likewise, I'm going to do that up here, and you want to kind of smooth it. You don't want to stretch this too much because it is a bias edge. So I'm going to do 1/4 of an inch from the top, and you can see I'm pretty far off. And when I put my pin through up here, kind of make sure it's all nice and straight, and that tells you kind of your alignment this way. And then I'm just going to pin that piece. So here's the trick. Don't stitch it from this side. I'm going to turn over and I'm going to stitch on the marked line, which is actually how paper piecing works. So I'm faking all of you and tricking you into doing paper piecing, but there's no paper. So I am going to peel this back and kind of fold it exactly on the line and make sure that I don't have anything glaring that's missing. I don't. Okay. I have coverage on all areas. So I'm going to go over to the machine and I'm going to stitch this, and then we're going to come back and hopefully it worked. Okay, moment of truth. When I flip it back over to this side, I did catch my background piece all the way across. Now, it's not a perfect 1/4 inch, but this is not a perfect project in that way. And when I flip this back, I cover pretty much all of my background fabric, which is what I'm looking for. Now, what I'm going to do is come back and I am going to trim this at a 1/4 inch, because if you notice, I have a lighter background fabric and you can see the dark fabric through it. So I don't want to leave that there. So I'm going to go and trim this off, and then I'm going to line up my other piece exactly the same way for the other side. And then I will have a mostly complete top. All right, we have now attached both background pieces, and when I flip it back, you can see it's nicely trimmed. This is what the back looks like. So again, this line that you marked, not seen by anybody. So what we're going to do now is attach a small piece for the trunk. So what I've done is just take a 2-inch strip of my background fabric and then cut it in half. It was originally the width of my entire piece, but I whacked it in half with my scissors because I was living on the edge. I'm going to mark the center of this trunk with a pin. And then what I need to do is align this to the center of the bottom of the tree. So all you have to do, you don't have to measure, you just fold it in half, match up those edges, take another pin, and just stick that there. Okay, so now I have this center marked with a pin. I have this center marked with a pin. I line the pins up. I take one pin out. I use the other pin to pin the two pieces together. And then my strip is going to overhang a bit because remember I inserted that square in the middle of the original width. So now I'm going to stitch this with probably a 1/4 inch seam. Here's hoping. Okay, I have it stitched. I need to go and press it, and I'm going to press it towards this background piece because there's so much bulk in the seams here. That's just how it wants to lie. So with that, it's then time to kind of square things up a bit. Now you can see I didn't get exact line up here at my top edge. That's okay. What I will end up doing is adding, probably get some 2.5 inch cut pieces and frame this whole thing up before I go quilt it. And just add a little bit more pop to that side. I'll have to see if I have some fun Christmas fabric or what I'm going to do. So let me go do that, and then we will come back and talk about, after quilting, how I have attached buttons, or how I will be attaching buttons to really jazz this up. Hey, it's me. I had filmed a portion of the video to show the button work in progress, but as it turns out, my computer ate it. So instead, I have the finished piece to show you, and I can explain how I actually attach the buttons. So you can see how I quilted it. There's some pretty dense swirls in the background. And then on the tree itself, all I did was stitch in the ditch before the buttons were attached, where all the piecing is for the trees. And I did use a pretty high loft batting. You can use a poly or a wool batting to give it some loft. That'll help push kind of the background down and give a little bit more depth to the tree itself, so the buttons kind of nestle in a bit. You could even double bat if you want, which is code for 2 pieces of batting in there. If you're going to do that, you might want to do a cotton or a cotton poly blend on bottom, and then something with a higher loft, like a poly or a wool on top. So I got the quilting done before I attached any of the buttons, because otherwise your machine is pretty likely to hit the buttons and break a needle, and that is no fun for anyone. So I did get the buttons stitched on. What you want to do is take a piece of chalk or just a light marker that won't show and mark the line that you want to follow with the garland, and that'll help you kind of not lose the train of where you're trying to go and end up with some weird wiggles. You can see some of my markings rubbed off by the time I got down to this part. So it's a little weird shaped, but I think that gives it character. So I did end up using every single one of these gold buttons from my stash. I am delighted that they are no longer in there and they're going into something fun for my house. I also alternated some red and white classic buttons. You can see that. So these were all hand stitched on before I bound the piece. It was trimmed only because trying to put a ruler to even up the edges with all these buttons on there is troublesome. So after trimming, before binding is when all the buttons went on, with the exception of this button at the top because it's overlapping the binding. This one went on after the binding went on. So in order to do this, after you've got everything marked, you just start at the top and you start placing buttons. And the stitch that I used is a pretty simple one. And yes, it shows on the back, but I'm not really that picky. This is going to be hanging against a wall. So it's a hand stitching. I used a thicker than normal thread. My normal 50 weight for piecing I didn't think would cut it, so I wanted to use something a little thicker. It's actually an upholstery weight thread. You can get that at most big box stores, or you can double up with some of your regular stitching thread if you really don't have anything else. Just remember not to go tugging on the buttons or let anyone else tug on them. Particularly little kids, buttons are not good for baby clothes because they can present a choking hazard. So just hang this up somewhere high where babies aren't going to get to it. So it's a lot of hand stitching, I will not lie. But it was pretty meditative to do this. I just had a nice holiday movie on that I watched while I stitched all of these on, and it went pretty quick. You don't have to do more than 1 to 2 stitches to hold each button down because, again, it's a decorative piece, not a functional piece. So I'm happy with how it turned out. I love the little hidden penguins that I stuck in here that I didn't know what else to do with, like all these gold buttons. And, you know, I lucked out having this giant red button for the top. So I'm happy with it. I've got my sleeve on. I've got the label stitched into the back. I need to write that label to figure out what to name this. So hopefully this has inspired you to make something of your own for the holidays. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And stay tuned for more tutorial videos. Thanks.